ما عفوا انا صار لي زمان ما عملت لايف من الجهاز هون. فخلينا نعيد. اهلا وسهلا فيكم جميعا بالتغطية اللايف للمؤتمر الصحفي للبنك الفدرالي وجيروم باول المتحدث الأشوس. رح نحكي هلا على السريع. الاجتماع رح يبلش بعد شي 3 دقائق، فرح احكي بالمختصر شو كان قرارهم للفائدة والستيتمنت لهم شو أهم شيء، لأنه صار شغلة مهمة ما بالإيجابية اللي توقعناها، ولكن خطوة إلى هذه الإيجابية. فرح نشرح لكم شو الموضوع وبعدين نحضر التغطية مع بعض داخل المؤتمر الصحفي. في حال صار أي تعليق أو جواب على سؤال ممكن نشرحه. ورح نكون عم نراقب السوق، سواء البيتكوين، الكريبتو أو الستوك ماركت، شو عم تتفاعل مع الحدث داخل هيدا. وبعدها بعد نهاية المؤتمر ممكن نحكي كيف رح يكون التحليل، يعني شو وين ممكن يروح السوق بعد هذه الأحداث كلها والأخبار كلها. ف بتمنى الشباب اللي صاروا مشتركين بالقناة اشتركوا بالقناة لأنه بيانا شوي ونوصل على 100,000. حيكون في مفاجأة كتير حلوة على 100,000، فبتمنى انكم تشتركوا بالقناة وحطوا لايك لهذا اللايف لحتى يوصل لأكبر عدد. خلينا نبلش هلا. أول شيء رح شارك الشاشة هون ونتأكد إنه في صوت لما بشارك الشاشة. لازم يكون في صوت. طيب واضح كله، واضحة الشاشة عندي. هلا هي الستيتمنت شباب، هي الستيتمنت اللي طلعت. خليني اتاكد بس انه واضح كله تمام. طيب بالستيتمنت اعلنوا انه ما راح ينزلوا الفائده، تمام، وبالتالي راح تبقى اوكي، راح يضلوا مينتين التارجت تبعهم على 4.5%، وهذا الشيء كان متوقع ومسعر بالسوق. ولكن الشيء اللي كان ممكن شوي يمكن متفائلين يحكوا عنه انه قديش رح يكون في تخفيض فائدة خلال سنة 2025. للأسف كمان ما عدلوا ولا هي، بقي توقعهم كمتوسط تخفيضتين لسه. تمام، تخفيضتين. هلا ممكن تكون ربعين، ممكن يكون ربع ونص، حسب شو، ولكن نتوقع انه لنهاية 2025 تكون نسبة الفائدة 3.75 تقريبا، بين 3.5 و 3.75. فإذا هيدا توقع ما زال نفسه. الشيء المهم واللي انا كنت ناطره كثير وصار لي عم بحكي عنه شهور، انه ايمت رح ينهوا التشديد الكمي. التشديد الكمي للشباب اللي ما بيعرفوا هو لما البنك الفدرالي بيكون عم يبيع عم يبيع سندات الخزينة اللي عنده، وبالتالي عم يسحب سيولة من السوق، وبالتالي عم يشدد كمية. تمام، يعني عم شدد الخناق على الاقتصاد. تمام. ف هن اساتهم كانوا عم يبيعوا، تمام، يعني عم يعملوا تشديد كمي. هلا المتوقع كان بسبب عدة احداث صارت. لا ممكن اذا صار وقت، هلا انا شرحتها بكثير فيديوهات من قبل، اذا صار وقت هلا ممكن ارجع اشرحها بتوسع شوي اكبر، ولكن انه لازم اجى الوقت انه يبلشوا يوقفوا هذا التشديد الكمي. هلا ما اعلنوا انهم وقفوا، ولكن اعلنوا تخفيض نسبة التشديد من 25 مليار ل 5 مليار على شو؟ التريجري سيكيورتيز اللي هي سندات الخزينة الأمريكية. فإذا هي خطوة ممتازة. لاحظوا قديش نزلوا من 25 مليار دولار ل 5 مليار دولار. خطوة إيجابية. يعني ما بقى رح يبيعوا، كانوا عم يبيعوا كل شهر عم يبيعوا 25 مليار، هلا رح يصيروا يبيعوا 5 مليار فقط. فهذه الخطوة بالعادة بتسبق، تمام، حتى هن يعملوها سموث او يعني يعني انسيابية. فهي بتسبق مرحلة توقيف التشديد كليا. تمام. ولكن تركوا، يعني هي بالنسبة لسندات الخزينة نزلوها بالنسبة، ولكن تركوا اللي بسمون agency debt and agency mortgage backed securities، تركوها هي 35 مليار عم يبيعوا كل شهر. إذا نزلوا فقط سندات الخزينة. هلا ماشي الحال، خطوة إيجابية بالاتجاه الصح. ما صار حدث كتير ضخم لحتى يعمل بامب بالسوق، ولكن عم نلاحظ إنه ما صار دمب. إذا هيدا البيتكوين، التفاعل البيتكوين لحديث اللحظة صار شوية هبوط قبل، وهلأ في هيدا الارتفاع. عم نلاحظ إنه الستوك ماركت كمان صار شوية هبوط قبل، وهلأ في ارتفاع. فإذا بشكل عام السوق حب الموضوع إنه بلشوا يخفضوا التشديد الكمي. تمام. لحديث اللحظة رح نشوف هلا بالمؤتمر الصحفي شو رح يحكي جيروم باول، وهل رح يكون في مفاجآت رح تغير هذا الإيجابية البسيطة، خلينا نقول لأنه ما صار في بامب. هل رح تغير الإيجابية البسيطة ولا لا؟ تمام. إذا عندكم أسئلة اكتبوها شباب بالتعليقات، ما تنسوا اللايك بعد إذنكم. خلونا نشوف اللايف لأنه لازم يبلش قريبا. المفروض هذا هو اللايف. بلش اللايف. خبروني إذا عم تسمعوا الصوت. أظن لا.
Focused on separating the signal from the noise as the outlook evolves. As we say in our statement, in considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We do not need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance, and we are well positioned to wait for greater clarity. In our SEP, FOMC participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward.
نشوف إذا في اليوتيوب عنده ترجمة للعربي مباشرة. يمكن لا.
Will be 3.9% at the end of this year and 3.4% at the end of next year, unchanged from December. While these individual forecasts are always subject to uncertainty, as I noted, uncertainty today is unusually elevated. And of course, these projections are not a committee plan or a decision. Policy is not on a preset course. As the economy evolves, we will adjust our policy stance in a manner that best promotes our maximum employment and price stability goals. If the economy remains strong and inflation does not continue to move sustainably toward 2%, we can maintain policy restraint for longer. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly or inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we can ease policy accordingly. Our current policy stance is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties that we face in pursuing both sides of our dual mandate. At today's meeting, we also decided to slow the pace of decline in our balance sheet. Since we began balance sheet runoff, our securities holdings have declined by more than $2 trillion. While market indicators continue to suggest that the quantity of reserves remains abundant, we have seen some signs of increased tightness in money markets. Beginning in April, the monthly cap on Treasury redemptions will be lowered from $25 billion to $5 billion. Consistent with the committee's intention to hold primarily Treasury securities in the longer run, we are leaving the cap on agency securities unchanged. This action has no implications for our intended stance of monetary policy and should not affect the size of our balance sheet over the medium term. The committee also continued its discussion.
هلا لحد اللحظة شباب هو بس عم يحكي الستيتمنت اللي شرحت لكم إياها قبل ما نبلش. تمام. بس عم يحكي شو القرارات اللي اتخذوها. أوكي. هلا ممكن وقف إذا في شيء معين، وقف واشرحه إذا في أفكار مهمة، بس رح نتأخر هيك بالبث. بس ما مشكلة، ممكن بس يفرق معنا تفاعل السوق. بس ما طلعت عندي الترجمة بالعربي. ما بعرف إذا حدا عنده خبرة بالموضوع، لأنه هون في بس ما طلع عندي عربي هون. ما بعرف إذا حدا عنده فكرة كيف بيعملوها، لأنه هاي السيتنجز ما شايف في شيء بدل على إنه تصير بالعربي.
Inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I will look forward to your questions.
Howard.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for your time. So, two things on sort of the real side here, with inflation and then GDP. How much of the higher inflation forecast for this year is due to tariffs? And since the policy path remains the same, are you effectively reading this as a one-time price level shock?
Okay, so how much of it is tariff? So let me say that it is going to be very difficult to have a precise assessment of how much of inflation is coming from tariffs and from other, and that's already the case. You may have seen that goods inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases given what was tariff and what was not very, very challenging. So the answer is clearly some of it, a good part of it is coming from tariffs, but we'll be working, and so will other forecasters, to try to find the best possible way to separate non-tariff inflation from tariff inflation. In terms of your sort of looking through question, too soon to say about that. As I've mentioned, it can be the case that it's appropriate sometimes to look through inflation if it's going to go away quickly without action by us, if it's transitory, and that can be the case in the case of tariff inflation. I think that would depend on the tariff inflation moving through fairly quickly, and it would depend critically as well on inflation expectations being well anchored, longer term inflation expectations being well anchored.
Well, I guess I'm looking at the out years here, and the fact that the policy path doesn't change at all, and inflation is unchanged in the out years also. Doesn't that imply you all have basically decided that there is no signal here, and that it's just we're back to transitory again?
So I think that's kind of the base case, but as I said, we really can't know that. We're going to have to see how things actually work out. And the fact that there wasn't much change, I think that's partly because you see weaker growth but higher inflation. They kind of offset, and also, frankly, a little bit of inertia when it comes to changing something in this highly uncertain environment. I think there is a level of inertia where you just say, maybe I'll stay where I am.
Colby.
Thank you, Colby Smith with the New York Times. You just described inflation expectations as well anchored, but has your confidence in that assessment changed at all, given the increase in certain measures and the high degree of uncertainty expressed by businesses, households, and forecasters?
So on inflation expectations, of course, we do monitor inflation expectations very, very carefully. Basically, every source we can find, and short-term, long-term, households, businesses, forecasters, market-based. And I think the picture broadly is this. You do see increases widely in short-term inflation expectations, and people who fill out surveys and answer questionnaires are pointing to tariffs about that. If you look in the survey world, if you look a little further out, you really don't see much in the way of an increase. Longer-term inflation expectations are mostly well anchored. If you look at
على المدى القصير في توقعات
بأنه ترتفع, and it's the same pattern.
التضخم, ولكن على المدى الطويل سادوا
markets are pricing in break-evens. Some higher inflation over the next year must be related to tariffs. We know from the surveys, but if you look out 5 years or the 5-year forward, you'll see that break-evens are either flat or actually slightly down in the case of the longer-term one. So we look at that, and we will be watching all of it very, very carefully. We do not take anything for granted. It's at the very heart of our framework, anchored inflation expectations, but that's what you see right now.
And how much weight do you put on the deterioration in consumer confidence surveys? You said recently that this is perhaps not the best indication of future spending, but I'm curious, what you think is behind this deterioration, and to what extent it could be a leading indicator for hard data.
So let's start with the hard data. We do see pretty solid hard data still. So growth looks like it's maybe moderating a bit, consumer spending moderating a bit, but still at a solid pace. Unemployment's 4.1%. Job creation most recently has been at a healthy level. Inflation has started to move up now, we think partly in response to tariffs, and there may be a delay in further progress over the course of this year. So that's the hard data. Overall, it's a solid picture. The survey data, both household and businesses, show significant rise in uncertainty and significant concerns about downside risks. So how do we think about that? And that is the question. As I mentioned the other day, as you pointed out, the relationship between survey data and actual economic activity hasn't been very tight. There have been plenty of times where people are saying very downbeat things about the economy and then going out and buying a new car.
الاستفتاءات اللي بيعملوها ما عم تمثل تماما
very carefully for signs of
المعلومات
weakness in the
الاقتصادية
real
اللي عم
data.
تظهر
Of
أو
course we
البيانات
will.
الاقتصادية اللي عم تظهر.
But I,
في اختلاف
given
نوعاً.
where we are, we think our policy's in a good place to react to what comes.
هي السؤال
and we
الأساسي
think that
كان
the
على
right thing to
إنه
do is to
consumer
wait here
spending يعني
for greater
مدى
clarity
صرف
about what the economy is doing.
الشعب تمام المستهلك انه خافف فانه هل هالشيء بيأثر ولا لا؟
Nick Timmeros, The Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, Chair Greenspan once defined price stability as an environment in which inflation is so low and stable over time that it doesn't materially enter into the decisions of households and firms.
Can you say that today, that we have that price stability, that households and businesses are ignoring price growth? When you see buy in advance psychology, big changes in inventories, and surveys that show consumers, at least in the short run, expect higher inflation.
So I do like that definition a lot. In fact, I used it at the recent conference where I spoke. So I think a world where people can make their daily economic decisions in businesses and they're not having to think about the possibility of significantly high inflation. We know inflation will bounce around. That is price stability. You know, I think we were getting closer and closer to that. I wouldn't say we were at that. Inflation was running around 2.5% for some time. I do think with the arrival of the tariff inflation, further progress may be delayed. The SEP doesn't really show further downward progress on inflation this year, and that's really due to the tariffs coming in. So delayed, but if you look at our forecasts, we do see ourselves getting back into the low twos in 26 and then down to 2 by 27, of course, highly uncertain. So I see progress having been made toward that, and then progress in the future. I think that progress is probably delayed for the time being.
If that's the case, why are there cuts in the SEP for 2025?
So again, people wrote down 2 cuts the last time, and they look at the they wrote down meaningful decline in growth from 2.1 to 1.7 in 2025, a tick up in the unemployment rate, so not much there, but core inflation up by 0.3, and so those kind of balance each other out. So people, not everybody, but on balance, people wrote down similar numbers. The changes aren't that big. The other factor, though, as I mentioned, is just really high uncertainty. What would you write down? I mean, it's really hard to know how this is going to work out. And again, we think our policy is in a good place. We think it's a good place where we can move in the direction where we need to. But in the meantime, it's really appropriate to wait for further clarity. And of course, the costs of doing that, given that the economy is still solid, are very low.
Edward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So with near 4% unemployment rate, that should be low enough to bring people in from the sidelines in terms of hiring. But we're seeing the hiring rates have been stuck at 2023, 2024 levels. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so that's a feature has been for some time a feature of this labor market. You have pretty high participation accounting for aging. You've got wages that are consistent with 2% inflation, assuming that we're going to keep getting relatively high productivity. We've got unemployment, pretty close to its natural level. But the hiring rate is quite low, but so is the layoff rate. So you look at initial claims or layoffs, so you're not seeing people losing their jobs, but you're seeing that people who don't have a job having to wait longer and longer. And, the question is, which way does that break? If we were to see a meaningful increase in layoffs, then that would probably translate fairly quickly into unemployment because people are, it's not a
نقطة
big
مهمة على
hiring
فكرة
market.
2%. ليش هن بدهم
Watching
ينزلوا
that,
تضخم
and
ل
it's just not in the data. It
2%؟
hasn't happened. What we've had is a low firing, low
أحد الأسباب
hiring
المهمة هي إنه
situation, and it seems to be in balance now for for the last
نسبة رفع
7-8 months.
الرواتب
That's where we are.
السنوية
There's
تتناسب مع
healthy levels of
2%.
job creation too. So overall,
فلما
it's a
بيكون
labor market
تضخم
that's in
أعلى من
balance, and, we
2%
watch it very
فعليا
carefully.
التضخم عم يرتفع أكثر من زيادة الرواتب.
policies in the economic numbers yet, and when do you anticipate
فلهيك
that?
مركزين على
In labor or
2%.
in other?
In labor and inflation, just across the economy, have we started to see the new policies take effect in the numbers?
Only in a kind of an early way. I mean, it's only been a few months, right? For example, the layoffs that are happening here are, they're certainly meaningful to the people involved, and they may be meaningful to a particular neighborhood or region or area, but at the national level, they're not significant yet. But we don't know. We don't know how far that will go. We'll find out much more. I mentioned that you saw we've had two very strong goods inflation readings in the last 2 months, which is very unexpected. I think hard to trace it to specific tariffs, but it must have something to do with, it's either noise and it'll come back, and that's very possible too. But if it is persistent,
نعم
then it
بدل
must be to
الشارتات
do
نشوف
with
الأسواق كيف عم
people
تتعامل
buying ahead of
في الوقت
tariffs or raising
وفيكم
prices
تقروا هون
ahead of
شو
tariffs
اسم
and things
الشيء
like
اللي عم
that.
ينفتح تمام؟
Those kinds of things happen, and they're very, very hard to capture because so much of it is indirect. A great example is their washing machines were tariffed in the last round of tariffs, and prices went up. But prices also went up on dryers, which were not tariffed. So the manufacturers they just kind of followed the crowd and raised it. So things happen very indirectly. And so there'll be a lot of work done in coming months to try to trace all that through. But ultimately, though, it's too soon to be seeing significant effects in economic data.
لا أسئلة ما كثير حساسة.
From Bloomberg News. Thanks, Chair Powell. You said transitory price increases from tariffs are the base case. Transitory is the base case. Wasn't it the base case last time? And didn't the FOMC forecast lower inflation ahead last time? And wasn't the lesson that it quickly got into services, haircuts, daycare, everything else? And so I'm just wondering why the 9 aren't taking that on board and are cutting twice this year.
When you say last time, are you talking about the last?
Pandemic, yes, during the
Because you
pandemic.
could have been talking about the last time there were tariffs, in which case the inflation was transitory. Yeah, no, of course, we're well aware of that. And, it's still the truth. If there's an inflationary impulse that's going to go away on its own, it's not the right policy to tighten policy, because by the time you have your effect, you're in effect by design, you are lowering economic activity and employment. And if that's not necessary, you don't want to do it. In real time, as we know, it's hard to make that judgment. And we're well aware, of what happened obviously with pandemic inflation. But I mean, we have to look at this as a different situation. There are differences and similarities.
يعني مؤقت
It's a
وعابر
different time.
فما مضطرين انه يشددوا السياسة النقدية بالتفاعل مع هذا الشيء المؤقت العابر. هذا الشيء كويس معناته ما حيرجعوا يشددوا أكثر.
To allow prices to go up at the same
ممكن
time.
يخلوها على حالها بس ما راح يشددوا
many of these prices through. So it's hard to say how this is going to work out.
Steve Leisman, CNBC.
Hello,
Thanks for taking my
Hello.
question, Mr. Chairman. The Bank of Canada, in its last policy statement, said monetary policy cannot offset the impacts of a trade war. What it can and must do is ensure that higher prices do not lead to ongoing inflation. I wonder if that kind of reflects your own sense of prioritization faced with higher prices and weaker growth, that the idea is you have to take care of inflation.
So we have two goals, right? We have maximum employment and price stability, and we have to balance those. And there can be situations in which they're in tension, right? And we actually have a provision in our consensus statement that says what we should do in that case. That's a very challenging, situation for any central bank, and certainly for us. And so what we say that we'll do is we'll look how far each of those two goals is, each of those two measures is from its goal. And then we'll ask how long we think it might take to get back to the goal for each of them, and we'll make a judgment because our tools work in one direction. We're either tightening or loosening. So it's a very challenging situation. Let me say, we don't have that situation right now. That's not where the economy is at all. It's also not where the forecast is. I don't know any mainstream forecast that really shows significant problems like that.
Well, just to follow up, yesterday the UCLA Anderson
الفكرة هي هو عم
forecast
يحكي كان على إنه
said
كندا
a high probability of a recession. Where do you stand on whether or not the slowdown you're seeing creates a higher probability or concern that you may have on recession? Thank you.
There's always an unconditional possibility of a recession. It might be broadly in the range of 1 in 4 at any time. If you look back through the years, it could be within 12 months a 1 in 4 chance of a recession. So the question is whether whether this current situation, those possibilities are elevated. I will say this. We don't make such a forecast. If you look at outside forecasts, forecasters have generally raised, a number of them have raised their possibility of a recession somewhat, but still at relatively moderate levels, still in the region of the traditional, because they were extremely low. If you go back 2 months, people were saying that the likelihood of a recession was extremely low. So has moved up, but it's not high.
عم يقول إنه هن كبنك فدرالي ما بيعملوا توقع للركود انه راح يصير ولكن في مؤسسات خارجيه بتعمل هذا الشيء منها بنوك واستثماريه. عم يقول انه بناء على هيدي الدراسات او التوقعات متوقعين ممكن يصير في ركود ولكن ليس بدرجه كثير عاليه. هذا حكي عم يقول انه من شهرين كانت منخفضه كثير وهلا ارتفعت شوي. هيدي الفكرة فما يعني مقبول.
I did answer that question in this very room some time ago, and I no desire to change that answer and have nothing new for you on that today.
ما خايفين من الركود بالمدى القريب. هذه
Maybe I have another mulligan. As you know, I wanted to go back to the consumer sentiment, particularly the inflation expectations in the University of Michigan survey. In the summer of 2022, you cited the rise in the long-term inflation expectations in that index as the reason that you went big with a 3/4 point hike. So I know you've talked about all the different measures now, but you seem to not be placing the same weight on that. And so I'm just wondering, are you dismissing that, what we saw last week from the University of Michigan, or does that carry the same weight as it did in the past?
So I mentioned it back then, but in no way did I place a huge weight on it. I think that was ex-post story, but it wasn't the case. That was a preliminary reading, and so is this. And it's also, this is that Michigan, the one you're referring to, the longer-term thing. We look at it, we don't dismiss data that we don't like, we force ourselves to look at it, but it is an outlier compared to market-based and compared to other survey-based assessments of longer-run inflation expectations. So we got to keep that in mind. And I would just say we look at all of them, and that was kind of an outlier, but nonetheless we take notice of it.
Thank you.
في موضوع بخصوص بنك كندا المركزي وقفوا تشديد الكمي.
There's a worry on Wall Street that when you say you want to study the net effect of the fiscal policies we may see on the economy, that you would end up waiting too long and be behind the curve in responding to any downturn. How can you reassure people that you can spot a problem early enough unless you decide to be preemptive?
Yeah, look, we're aware of we're well aware of how things are going to evolve and the time frames and all that, and we will use our tools to foster achievement of our goals to the best we can, and of course we're going to try to be timely with that. For right now, the hard data are pretty solid. We are obviously aware of the soft sentiment data and the high uncertainty, and we're watching that carefully, and we think it's a good time for us to wait for further clarity before we consider adjusting our policy stance.
Do you think it's going to be hard to get clarity in a government by tweet? I mean, do you have a feeling that at some point you actually will have a forecast you can trust?
Government by tweet,
It's hard to say when that will be. These decisions are going to be made, and they're going to be implemented, and then we'll know. At that point, we'll know what the decisions are, and we'll have to make assessments then about the implications for the economy. Those things will happen. A lot of them will happen over the course of, in coming months, certainly over the course of this year. and we'll be adapting as we go.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. At the beginning, you were talking about separating the signal from the noise and tariff inflation from non-tariff inflation. Can you walk us through what that looked like over the last couple of months, if there were specifics from the January meeting to now that helped you make those distinctions?
So when we say separating the signal from the noise, that's just a way of saying that things are highly uncertain.
كندا
You know, you're reading about
وعدة
developments,
دول
the
كبيرة
news is
بالعالم
full
إنه
of
الوقت
developments
تجديد
of
الكمية
tariffs being put
هذا
on and
الشيء
taken
كويس.
off and things like
معناتها
that.
هن
That's some
يعني
of that is
الفكرة هي إحنا
noise in the
السيولة اللي
sense that
بدنا إياها ما بس من
it's not
أمريكا
really
بدنا إياها
telling
من
you
العالم كله.
anything. You're
عم
trying to
نشوف
extract a
الصين
signal from that,
فعليا
and the
وقفت
signal is
تجديد عم
what's going to be the
بالعكس عم
effect on
تعمل
economic
تيسير
activity, on
بشكل
inflation,
معين
on employment, and
عم
all
تضخ
those things.
سيولة.
So
كندا
that's what when we
وقفت
say
أوروبا
signal.
نوعا
So the
ما
second thing was
بيان أمريكا.
Or
شفنا
similarly
هلا
for tariff
تبطيء
inflation, non-tariff inflation, ways that you're making the
تشديد.
decision.
that's sort of a
هاي
special
مرحلة
case of
انتقالية.
that. You know, with the idea being
هن صامدين
And I do
أكثر
think
شيء
that
لأنه
the first 2
اقتصادهم
months of
أقوى
this year
شيء
are a great example.
يستحمل
You've got
فترة
high
تشديد أطول.
readings for
هي
goods
الفكرة.
inflation after a string of readings that average close to zero, and you have to ask, it's coming during tariffs, but you know, you can't, it's very hard to actually scientifically go back and match up those increases and say, yes, I can prove that that's from tariffs, but it kind of has to be to some extent. Plus noise, there can be idiosyncratic readings in various categories which will shortly reverse, and that happens too, and that could be a big piece of it. You know, I think we'll know, in a couple of months we'll know whether those were, you know, where that really was from. But that's another case where I think it's going to be very, very challenging to unpack the inflation that we see over the course of this year and be able to say with confidence how much of that came from inflation and how much of it, from tariffs and how much of it didn't. But that's what we'll be doing. We'll be doing that, and so will everybody else, and we'll all be trying very hard to make that assessment. And, you know, I'm sure we will make a lot of progress on that, and we already have, but it's going to be a challenge.
Do you have a sense yet as to what, in your mind, would make something cross from noise to a signal, what that threshold would look like?
You know, it would depend on what we're talking about. I mean, obviously, you're looking for direct evidence that particular pieces of inflation are or are clearly not caused by tariffs. For example, if it's something that was, you know, in the service sector that was far away from anything that's tariffed, you might think, okay, well, that is, like, frankly, housing services inflation, which, by the way, has been behaving well, you know, which for some time was kind of our problem. Now it's slow, but it's definitely, you know, moving down in a very good way. It's more now with goods and to some extent with non-housing services inflation.
لكن لساتنا عند مقاومة قوية. نشوف هيدي هلا إذا رح يخترقها ولا لا.
Thanks for taking our questions, Chair Powell. Kelly O'Grady, CBS News.
S&P
So consumer sentiment has
مربع
dipped dramatically, but you say the economy and the hard data is still solid. What is your message to consumers that clearly disagree and don't feel that strength? Because the hard data they're looking at is their grocery bill.
Okay, so a couple things. The grocery bill is about past inflation, really. There was inflation in 21, 2, and 3, and prices went up. The current level, it's not the change in prices, it's they're unhappy, and they're not wrong to be unhappy that prices went up quite a bit, and they're paying a lot for those things. So I think that is the fundamental fact, and has been for a long time, a couple of years, why people are unhappy with the economy. It's not that the economy is not growing. It's not that inflation is really high. It's not that unemployment is high. It's none of those things. We have 4.1% unemployment. We've got 2% growth, and you know it's a pretty good economy. But people are unhappy because of the price level, and we completely understand and accept that.
And just to follow up,
عم نقول إنه الارتفاع بأسعار المنتجات بأمريكا هي ما بسبب التضخم الحالي، بسبب التضخم القديم نتيجة تضخم الأسعار السابق السنتين ثلاثة الماضيين.
Yeah, I mean, remember we came into this with at the December meeting, the median was 2 cuts. The median was, and so you come in and you see, broadly speaking, weaker growth but higher inflation. And they kind of balance each other out. So you think, and unemployment is there's really only a 1/10 change. So there's just not a big change in the forecast. There really isn't. Modest, you know, meaningfully higher growth and meaningfully higher inflation, which call for different responses, right? So they cancel each other out, and people just said, okay, I'm going to stay here. But the second factor is it's so highly uncertain. is just, we're sitting here thinking, and we obviously are in touch with businesses and households all over the country. We have an extraordinary network of contacts that come in through the reserve banks and put in the beige book, and also through contacts at the board. And we get all that, and we do understand that sentiment has fallen off pretty sharply, but economic activity has not yet. And so we're watching carefully. So I would tell people that the economy seems to be healthy. We understand that sentiment is quite negative at this time. And that probably has to do with, turmoil at the beginning of an administration that's making, big changes in areas of policy. And that's probably part of it. I do think the underlying unhappiness people have about the economy, though, is more about the price level.
Victoria. Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I wanted to ask, first of all, if you could clarify, you were talking about how tariffs were a good part of the uptick in the inflation forecast, and I was just wondering what that specifically refers to. Is that the tariffs that have already been put in place? Is that anticipating some of the tariffs that might be coming on April 2nd? And then also, if you wouldn't mind talking a little more about the balance sheet decision and what drove that. Did that have anything to do with expectations of how the debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling, might affect the reserve supply?
So in the ACP, you'll see that there's not further progress on core inflation this year. We're kind of flatlining, going sideways. We don't ask people to write down how much of this is from tariffs and how much of it is not, but some of it is from tariffs. We know that tariffs are coming in. We know that they're probably already, all forecasters have tariff inflation affecting core PCE inflation, core CPI inflation this year, without exception. I'm not aware of an exception. So it's in there. I can't tell you how much of that it is. In terms of the balance sheet, so yeah, I think, I guess the way I'd say it is, it was the flows in and out of the TGA that got us thinking about it. But as we thought about it, we really came to the view that this was a good time to make the move that we made. And broadly, committee that came around to the view that we would do the same thing we'd already done, which is I guess in June, was it June, whenever it was, we lowered the pace of QT, and we're just going to do that again. We're going to cut it roughly in half. And the sense of that is, if you're cutting the pace of QT roughly in half, then the runway is probably doubled. Okay, so it's going to be slower for longer. And people really like that. People thought that's a good idea. It's like a plane. You can think of it like a plane coming in for a landing. As we get closer, and by the way, we still think that reserves are abundant, although you begin to see some of the things we look at begin to react a little bit, but we still think that they're abundant. And of course, now the TGA is emptying out, so reserves are higher now, so you can't really see the underlying signal. So we came around to the view, and it had a lot of appeal, and so we did it. It has no implications at all for monetary policy. It has no implications at all for the ultimate size of the balance sheet. It isn't sending a signal in any hidden way that you can try to tease out. It's just not there. We're basically, it's very consistent with our plans and our practices that we've published and that we've followed since we began this, what is a very successful rundown of the balance sheet. Again, the second time that we've slowed the pace, and we've said that we would stop when we were somewhat above the level we judge as ample. And clearly we're not at that level yet, but we're going to be approaching it more slowly. It's a common sense kind of a thing, and it had pretty broad appeal, I will say.
Claire.
هلا عم يقولوا انه اساتهم المخزون عندهم ساته عالي، يعني ما وصل لمرحله خطيره. للاسف هذا الشيء بالنسبه لنا ما كثير منيح، لانه ما عم يشعروا بالخطر حتى يوقفوا التشديد الكمي بشكل قوي.
So when we talk about inflation expectations being well anchored, we're talking about longer run inflation expectations, and they really haven't moved much. I mean, if at all. There's one reading that everyone's focusing on that's higher, but the other survey readings and the market-based readings all show relatively
يبطئوا قد ما بيقدروا
well-anchored inflation
عملية التشديد.
expectations. You would expect
ولكن هذا الشيء رح يطول المدة اللي هن هلا فيها.
would move around because conditions change.
وهذا الشيء ما كويس لنا.
We have tariffs coming in. We don't know how big, what's big. So many things we don't know, but we kind of know.
فهلا رح احكي باخر اللايف
and they
شو
tend
ممكن
to
يكون
bring growth
السيناريوهات.
down. They tend to bring inflation up.
فالشباب الجديد معنا شباب
So I would say,
اتركوا بالقناة بدنا
I'm not
نسوق على
dismissing what we're
الجرس.
seeing in short-term inflation expectations.
لايكات
We, as I mentioned, follow that very carefully. But when we say expectations are well anchored, we're really looking at longer terms, 5 year and out, and there's really no story to tell 5 years and out, either in market-based or in surveys. But we'll watch it.
هذا المخزون هذا المخزون تبع البنك الفدرالي اللي عم يبيعوا منه.
Any evidence that longer term or medium term inflation expectations are moving.
المفروض هلا تبطأ العملية في البيع. تمام.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. Treasury Secretary Bessent has observed that a large share of job growth over the last couple of years has been in what he calls government or government-adjacent sectors, healthcare, education. Do you agree that there's some weakness in underlying private job growth, and do you see the composition of job growth as something that has policy implications?
So that has been the case. We talked about that over the course of the last year. There were some good number of months and times when a lot of the job creation was concentrated in, educational institutions, healthcare, state governments, things like that. There were also times when private sector job growth has been moving in a healthy range. I mean, they're all jobs, but and remember, we're at very low unemployment for quite a time now. So I think it's a good labor market, but it's something that we monitor carefully. From our standpoint, employment is employment. But the elected government is entitled to have. We don't have policies that address different kinds of employment, but the elected government has a different role, and they can have those.
Here's a quick QT question. Does the committee envision at some point tapering the MBS runoff as well?
I think tapering it. I don't know. There's no plan to do that. At a certain point, we'll stop runoff. And we may or may not stop MBS runoff, though, because we want to stop runoff in net at some point. We haven't made any decisions about that. We want the MBS to roll off our balance sheet. We really strongly desire that. So, but we haven't made any decisions about that. I think we'd look carefully at letting that keep going, but hold the overall size of the balance sheet in, constant at some point, a point that we're not out yet.
Simon.
MBS المورجج بوند
Thank you, Chair Powell. Several times today you've said that you feel you're well positioned
عم
to wait for
يضلوا
greater clarity.
يبيعوا
At the same time,
يضلوا
you
يبيعوا
point to quite a
35
few
مليار
growth
بالشهر.
risks at the moment. We've seen a stock market
بدهم
that's
يتخلصوا
gone
منه.
quite wobbly, rapidly cooling housing sales, plunge in confidence surveys. Today, not only did the S&P mark down the growth outlook, 17 of 19 see risks to the downside. So my question is, how confident are you that you're well positioned, or is that one more thing that you're uncertain about?
I'm confident that we're well positioned in the sense that we're well positioned to move in the direction we'll need to move. I don't know anyone who has a lot of confidence in their forecast. I mean, the point is we are at, we're at a place where we can cut.
اتوقع رح يجي السؤال بالاخير عن البيتكوين وعلى الريزيرف وهالقصص فحضروا حالكم
هنيك that's well positioned. Forecasting right now, forecasting is always very, very hard, and in the current situation, I just think uncertainty is remarkably high.
And sorry, standing here today, would you be surprised to pivot back towards rate cuts in May?
I think we're not going to be in any hurry to move, and as I mentioned, I think we're well positioned to wait for further clarity and not in any hurry.
هذا جواب سيء. إنه ما نم مستعجلين إنه ينزلوا.
Thank you, Chair Powell. The Fed statement released today removed the line that previously said the committee judges that the risks to achieving its employment and inflation goals are roughly in balance. Can you explain the decision to remove that line? Does it mean that you're now more concerned about inflation or about employment?
Actually, it does not mean either of those things. sometimes with language, it lives its useful life, and then we take it off, and that was the case here. There's really not meant to be any signal here. Over the past year, conveying the sense of the balance of risks was important, that they be in balance or close to being in balance. That was useful as we approached liftoff, if you remember, but we're past that. I'm sorry, no, beginning to cut. So we just took it out. I actually would say that the more important thing now about risks, and this is in the pages like 10, 11, 12 of the SEP, if you look, participants widely raised their estimate of the risks to our uncertainty, but also of the risks to growth and our employment and inflation mandates. That's a more salient point now than whether they're in balance.
Just on the stock market has obviously declined significantly since the Fed last met. Are you concerned at all about some of the market volatility having a real economic impact in terms of hurting business spending or consumer spending, especially among higher income households?
So financial conditions matter to us because, financial conditions are the main channel to the real economy through which our policy has its effects. So they're important. But what matters from a Fed standpoint for the macro economy is material changes to overall financial conditions that are persistent, that last for a while, long enough to actually affect economic activity. So that's what we're looking for. I'm not going to opine on the appropriate level of any market, equity, debt, commodities, or anything like that. And I would just point you to the bigger picture again. The real economy, the hard data, are still in reasonably good shape. It's the soft data, it's the surveys that are showing, significant concerns, downside risks, and those kind of things. We don't dismiss that. We're watching it carefully, but, we don't want to get ahead of that. We want to focus on the hard data. If that's going to
عم يسألوا كان إنه الستوك ماركت
and of course we'll understand that.
من آخر اجتماع عملوه، فهل هذا الشيء يعني بيخليهم يفكروا بموضوع لا فعم يقولوا إنه نحن بتهمنا الستوك ماركت لأنه هي انعكاس للاقتصاد بشكل عام. معناتها إذا هبطت الستوك ماركت كثير رح يغيروا شيء بسياساتهم.
Well, fortunately, we're in a situation where we have seen inflation move down from, higher levels to pretty close to 2%, while the unemployment rate has remained very consistent with full employment, 4.1%. So we now have inflation coming in from an exogenous source, but the underlying inflationary picture before that was, basically 2.5% inflation, I would say, and 2% growth and 4% unemployment. So that's what we did. That's what together the economy accomplished. So I don't see any reason to think that we're looking at a replay of the 70s or anything like that. Inflation, underlying inflation is still running in the 2s with probably a little bit of a pickup associated with tariffs. So I don't think we're facing, I wouldn't say we're in a situation that's remotely comparable to that.
And last month, the idea of a Doge dividend was proposed, which would send $5,000 checks to every taxpayer from Doge savings. President Trump and Elon Musk have supported this. There's reports there could be a bill introduced on Capitol Hill. What impact might that have on household savings and spending in terms of your growth and outlook for inflation?
It's not appropriate for me to speculate on political ideas or fiscal policy for that matter, so I'm gonna pass on that one. Thank you.
Daniel.
نقول ترامب وإيلون ماسك كانوا مقترحين إنه يعطوا $5,000 لكل واحد من الشعب الأمريكي. إذا صار هذا الشيء توقع بصير عندنا بامب بالالتكوينز.
So since the very beginning, we've had kind of a placeholder. The staff has a placeholder of a range of possible outcomes from tariffs and from trade policy generally, and they generally assume full retaliation in those. And so that's kind of baked into the numbers. What happens, it will be complicated, and there will be some retaliation and some not, and all that. But ultimately, they're trying to, with the placeholder, give us a broad sense of what this might look like. When we actually know the specifics, we'll be able to have still uncertain, but better informed forecasts. So yes, that's in there.
Last question goes to Jean. Hi, Chair Powell. Jean Young with MNI Market News.
Last question.
Had a couple questions on the balance sheet change that you made. So the minutes had initially described your discussion on slowing QT as temporary until the debt ceiling is resolved. But from what you said earlier, it doesn't sound like there's a desire to kind of regain the pace of QT that we have at the moment after the debt ceiling is resolved. Is that the case?
Yeah, so we looked at pausing and we looked at slowing, and really people came together very strongly behind slowing, not pausing, for a variety of reasons. And so people really came to be, pretty strongly in favor of this move. It slows down the path and probably lengthens it, doubles it effectively by slowing by half. That people thought that's a good place to be. It'll help us assure that this path is a smooth one as we get closer and closer to that. So that's how that came about.
Well, I guess my question is more, was that meant to be a temporary measure during the debt ceiling episode, or?
It was actually the TGA flows, Treasury General Account flows, that got us thinking about this. But the more we thought about it, we came around to this. And it is, yes, it was provoked. The original discussion was provoked by that, but I think what we came up with, though, was broader than that and different than that. It does address that issue, but it really is also, it fits in really nicely with our principles and our plans and the things we've done before and the things we said we would do. So that's why pretty strong support. I'd just say it's nothing to do with monetary policy, nothing to do with the size of the balance sheet. It's just kind of a common sense adjustment as you get closer and closer. Let's slow down a little bit again, and that way we'll be more and more confident that we're getting where we need to get. You can take our time getting there. We're shrinking the balance sheet every month, and we think it was a good play, and as I mentioned, well supported. Thanks very much.
اوكي شباب. طيب. أول شيء شكرا للصامدين معنا لهلا لأنه 90% من الأسئلة نقلة معنا. فشكرا لصمودكم. خلينا نشوف شو وضع السوق بعد الاجتماع. هلا اول شيء رح اعطيكم ملخص عام للشباب، حتى الشباب اللي دخلوا جديد. ف برأيي هذا الاجتماع إذا فينا نعطيه عنوان فهو التطمين. انا حاسه انه هو، لاحظوا انه ما كان في اي مفاجآت، ما كان في اي صدمات، ما كان في اي اسئله الى معاني خبيثه لحتى تتحرك السوق. فاذا هو بشكل عام تطمين. حتى كذا سؤال كان موضوع الركود، الجواب كان كثير ريلاكست، يعني هذا ما كان في واضح انه في تخوف من ركود قريب، ركود اقتصادي. فبشكل عام الوضع مقبول جيد، يعني يعتبر ايجابي بدرجه مقبوله، وعم نشوف انه السوق حتى سعره لحد هاللحظه بهذا الشكل. فعم نشوف الاس ام بي صار في ارتفاع مقبول، يعني عم نحكي بتقريب 1.3%. عم نشوف البيتكوين كمان صار في هذا نوعا ما، اتوقع تقريبا نفس النسبة 2%. وعم نشوف الدولار عمل هبوط. طبعا هلا بدنا نفرق بين حركة السوق خلال الاجتماع وحركة السوق ما بعد الاجتماع، لأنه خلال الاجتماع بيكون في كثير عم يعملوا نيوز تريدينج، يعني تداول أخبار، فممكن يكون في حركة ما هي الاتجاه الصحيح للسوق. المهم كيف رح السوق يتحرك بعد الاجتماع. ف إذا صار في كسر لدعوم معينة أو اختراق لمقاومات معينة وبعد الاجتماع حافظت على هذه دعوم المقاومات، فهذا اتجاه قابل للاستمرار. تمام، هذا الشيء لازم تطلعوا عليه دائما بعد الاجتماع. فبس عم لاحظ مثلا هلا الدولار عمل دمب قوي تقريبا، بنحكي على 0.4%. هي تعتبر دمب قوي بالدولار، وهلا عم في تصحيح للاعلى. فالذهب حاول يخترق. اذا نطلع هون على شغله اللي هي هذا الاختراق اللي له كان عباره عن شو؟ مع بيرش دايفرجنس، وبالتالي غالبا اختراق فاشل. نحن بدنا الذهب عفوا يهبط، ما بدنا بقى الذهب يستمر ارتفاع. هذه نقطة كتير مهمة لازم تركزوا عليها. بعتذر من كل الأشخاص اللي عم مشترين ذهب ليوصل لل6000. نحن هدفنا بالكريبتو وببقية الأسواق إنه الذهب يعمل قيمته، لأنه من هيدي اللحظة ببلش البيتكوين انطلاقته. فإذا بشكل عام كان موضوع جيد. البيتكوين دوميننس حتى نلاحظ هذا الشيء بظن كان قبل صار في كسر لخط الترند هيدا. إذا نطلع على 4 ساعات ممكن يبين أكثر. هذا الشيء كويس، يعني لسه ما في حركات كتير كبيرة، بس مبدئيا الالت كوينز عم تاخذ شوية سيولة من البيتكوين. هذا شيء جيد. بس بشكل عام الفكرة اللي انحكت برأيي نوعا ما صار في اطمئنان انه ما في عنا ركود قريب. هذا الشيء ممكن يخلي الأسواق ترجع تتعافى، تمام، ويكون هذا الهبوط اللي شفناه هون. يعني احنا شفنا بالاس ام بي بالنازداك عفوا 14% هبوط، تمام. وعم نشوف هلا شو اختراق للترند الهابط هيدا اللي كان تبع الدب. طبعا هون زاوية الترند كانت حادة جدا، ف بدنا ننتظر أكثر. هلا ممكن يتشكل عنا زاوية تاني، ولكن مبدئيا في تصحيح للأعلى. رح نشوف هذا التصحيح. ممكن بعد يصير في محاولة تانية للهبوط، بس إذا كان الأمور طبيعية بالاقتصاد فما لازم ترجعوا تكسر القيعان اللي عملتها، تكون فقط تصحيح هبوطي وبعدها استكمال للارتفاع. إذا صار هذا الشيء فبنكون شكلنا قاع الكريبتو، تمام، بيكون قاع الكريبتو ثابت. ولاحظنا فكرة مهمة اللي هي ما كتير خايفين هن من قرارات التعرفة اللي عم يفرضها ترامب على كندا والمكسيك والصين وأوروبا، لأنهم عم يعتبروه أنه هي شيء مؤقت ومرفوعوا له مؤقت، وبالتالي ما رح يتفاعلوا معه بتشديد كمي. وهذا الشيء جيد، هذا الشيء إيجابي، تمام. بس ممكن يطول فترة، طول المدة الزمنية اللي رح تخليهم ينهوا التشديد الكمي ويبلشوا نوعا ما تيسير كمي. هلا في بعض الاشياء اللي ممكن تجبرهم، هل نحكي بالاجتماع الجاي او اللي بعده، على هذا الشيء. وهن برسالتهم السابقة، يعني دائما بالستيتمنت بيذكروا كثير امور شو بدهم يعملوا. بالستيتمنت الماضية كانوا ذاكرين فكرة انه ممكن ينهوا التشديد الكمي بنص السنة، تمام. يعني عم نحكي بشهر 6 ممكن ينهوا التشديد الكمي. فالتبطيء الحالي هو ممكن يكون تمهيد لإنهاء التشديد بشهر 6، تمام. هذا الشيء عم يخلي شوي هيدي السايكل تكون أطول من غيرها، ولكن المهم إنه تضل مستقرة الأمور، ما يصير عندنا صدمات كبيرة. فنحن هدفنا نراقب هذا الشيء، إنه فعلا ما راح يصير في صدمات كبيرة. هذا من جانب البنك الفدرالي، ولكن من جانب الحكومة الأمريكية وتحديدا الخزانة الأمريكية اللي هي بالأصل بتعمل صك لسندات الخزينة، هن عندهم أزمة كبيرة حاليا، واللي هي إنه وصلوا لسقف الدين، تمام، اللي فينهم يتدينوا. يعني وصلوا للسقف. شو هو الدين بالأخير؟ إنه بينزلوا سندات خزينة للبيع لعالم تشتريها، وبالتالي كأنهم دينوا من كل مستثمرين العالم ومنهم البنك الفدرالي كمان. فوصلوا للسقف، فهلأ لازم يعملوا اجتماع ليقرروا يعلوا السقف أو لا، بس لازم يعلوا بالأخير إذا بدهم يضل الدولة، مؤسسات الدولة عم تشتغل بشكل نظامي. فإذا وصلانين لنقطة حرجة. أول شيء موضوع سقف الدين. ثاني شيء عندهم شيء اسمه ماتشور أو البونز اللي كانت يعني فعليا كأن الدين اللي كان اخذينه من قبل ولكن هلا خلصت مدته، يعني بنسميها ماتشور بونز. هي سندات خزينة انتهت صلاحيتها، لازم إعادة تمويلها، والرقم كتير كبير بيوصل ل 9 تريليون دولار خلال 2025. فهذا رقم بده سيولة هائلة لا يقدروا يعيدوا تمويله. فكمان هي أزمة تانية، لأن سقف الدين ماتشورد، السندات الخزينة الخاصة صلاحيتها، ومخزونهم البنك عندهم الترجري يعني الخزانة الأمريكية عندها سيولة. ما هي سيولتها هي إذا بنطلع هون بنلاقي، أشوف لكم إياها، أتوقع هذا هو ترجري جنرال أكاونت. تمام. فهن حاليا كان عندهم تقريبا 800 مليار دولار. عم نحكي لشهر 2 فبراير كان عندهم 800 مليار. فلاحظوا انه شو صار من بعدها، من بعد ما وصلوا لسقف الدين ما عاد فينهم يتدينوا اكثر كحكومه، بلشوا يصرفوا من هذا الحساب. فمنلاحظ انه مدى الهبوط بقيمه مقتنياتهم هبطت من 800 مليار ل 500 مليار، وعم يصرفوا منه لانه ما بقى عندهم مصاري تاني يصرفوا منه، بدهم يمشوا امور الدوله، فعم يصرفوا منها. هلا لما هي توصل لمستوى حرج، تمام، مثل هون المستويات الحرجه اللي كان وصلنا نطلع عم نحكي تحت ال 100 مليار، صار في هون رح يكون في ازمه. هون رح يصير في اجباري البنك الفدرالي لازم يتدخل، لانه ما معقول يترك الدوله كلها تفوت بالحيط. تمام، لازم يتدخل. فاذا لبين ما يحلوا يعملوا اجتماع للكونغرس ويعلوا سقف الدين، رح يضلوا يصرفوا من هذا الحساب. اذا خلصوا بالتوازي فممكن ينفدوا. تمام، يعني اذا كان عم ينزل وعلوا سقف الدين بينفدوا، بيرجعوا بيتدينوا وبيمشوا الموضوع. ولكن الاتجاه العام هن ما بدهم كثير يتدينوا، وخاصة حاليا نسبة الفائدة عالية. يعني أي شيء هلا يتدينوه بفائدة 4.5%، يعني كثير كبيرة، نحكي على تريليونات بفائدة 4.5%. فترامب عم يحاول يضغط على البنك الفدرالي بعدة طرق لينزلوا الفائدة، لحتى لما يرجعوا يتدينوا أو يعيدوا تمويل سندات الخاصة صلاحيتها يتدينوها أو يعملوها بفائدة منخفضة. ولكن عم نلاحظ إنه البنك الفدرالي ما عم يتجاوب بهذا الاتجاه لحديث اللحظة، وعنده فقط ضل على سياسته نفسها، صامد بسياسته. تمام. فإذا لسه في أزمة قريبة لازم تنحل. فرح نشوف بالاجتماع الجاي شو رح يصير، شو بيكون صار بحساب شو اسمه الخزانة، وشو صار بموضوع سقف الدين، وهل انحلت قبل الاجتماع الجاي ولا لا. لأنه الاجتماع الجاي عنا يا ثواني ب7 ماي. تمام، ب7/5 7/5 لازم يكونوا حلوا هيدي المشكلة قبل، لحتى ما يصير عندهم كارثة. تمام. في أمور كتير مهم كمان ممكن نشوفها. لا ما بيطول عليكم، بس بشكل عام الوضع مقبول. يعني كانت نتيجة الاجتماع مقبولة. هلا عم نشوف، خلينا نشوف كيف تفاعل لحد هاللحظة السوق بعد هذا الشيء. عم نشوف انه الاس ام بي عم يصحح هلا، مثل ما قلنا المهم انه المقاومات اللي تتحول لدعوم. فاذا تحولت لدعوم فينا نتوقع السيناريو اللي حرق لهذا الاتجاه. عم نشوف البيتكوين نفس الشيء، كمان البيتكوين عنده اخترق هاي المقاومات. فهلا اذا حولها لدعم البيتكوين احتمال يطلع ويحاول يخترق المنطقة 2 رمادي، لأنه إذا ما قدر يخترق المنطقة 2 رمادي فنرجع لنفس السيناريو اللي أنا حكيته باللافات السابقة، إنه ونزلت لكم إياه حتى باللايف جديد، إنه يبقى عم يعمل مثلث متصاعد بهيدي المنطقة كلها، انطلاقا من خط الترند. هيدا نطلع على الديلي ببين معنا خط الترند هذا، تمام، و المنطقة 2 رمادي، يعني هون نبقى فيها فترة طويلة إذا ما قدر يخترق المنطقة 2 رمادي بهاليومين 3. أوكي، ف نتوقع كمان مرحلة شوي هادئة لبين ما يصير عندنا أي نوع من أنواع الاختراقات، تمام. بس إن شاء الله يعني نتمنى إذا ما صار كارثة كبيرة إن شاء الله بيكون هذا هو القاع. طيب شوف شوي أسئلتكم على السريع. أهلا بشباب الأكاديمية. بعد ما اقتنع حسب الخطط الزمنية إنه قوام العملات الرقمية رح تكون بين 21 نيسان و 21 أيار، أو أجلت لشهر 10. لا أجلناها، لأنه نحن تذكروا هلا رح أعمل فيديو مراجعة بالأخير للتحليل اللي كنا عاملين لقارة الطريق والماركت، لأنه تغيرت كثير أحداث. مثل ما بتعرفوا إنه كان في عندنا نحن تاريخ 22 أبريل اللي هو قمة، بس بسبب بطء الأحداث اللي صايرة غالبا ما هذا هو يكون قمة البول ماركت، وإنما هذا هو التاريخ اللي هو 3 نوفمبر. هلا مثل ما قلنا هذا بالأخير تحليل زمني موجي، مانو بولت بروف، يعني مانو شيء منزل، وإنما هو شيء يعني خلينا نقول تقريبي لحتى نحن كمان نخطط هذه المرحلة. فرح أرجع أعمل فيديو تحديث لهذا التحليل وشو التوقع الجديد اللي ممكن يكون. فتأكدوا إنكم فاعلين الجرس شباب. لسه موسم العملات بين شهر 4 و5 ولا رح يروح لشهر 10 و11؟ الاحتمال الأكبر إنه يروح لآخر السنة، لأنه مثل ما شفنا خطة الفدرالي إنه يكونوا بطيئين بنهاية التشديد، وبالتالي حتطول شوي الفترة. ولكن مجرد ما نهوا التشديد، إذا كان الوضع هن أكيد ما حينهوا غير إذا كان بلش التضخم عم ينزل بشكل صحي وتدريجي، وبالتالي من بعدها السوق رح يسعر إنه رح يصير في نوع من أنواع التيسير الكمي، وبالتالي رح يبلش العالم تشتري الالت كوينز استباقا لشو اللي ممكن يصير بالاشهر اللي بعدها. فما شرط بنفس التوقيت اللي هن ببلشوا في تيسير كمي يصير في عندنا البامب بالاسواق، ممكن يصير في عندنا قاعده قبل، يعني قاعده تاسيس للالت كوينز قبل ما يصير في التيسير الكمي، وهذا ممكن يعطينا اكثر من شهر قبل. وبعدها البامب بصير من بعد ما يصير في اعلان لتيسير الكمي او شيء شبيه بالتيسير الكمي. ممكن هن ما يقولوا تيسير كمي لانه هي صارت الكلمه مغضوب عليها او مكروهه من بعد الكوفيد وما حدث بعد الكوفيد، فممكن يعملوا تيسير كمي ضمني وليس معلن بكلمات مثل التيسير الكمي او quantitative easing هن بيقولوا. فممكن بمعنى انه هن يضخوا سيوله ضمنيا بدل ما يكونوا عم يسحبوا السيوله. مثل ما قلنا هلا هن عم يسحبوا، لاحظوا هون هذا الحساب تبعهم، هذا الحساب تبعهم، تمام. هيدي الاسيتس هن لحديت هلا عم يشددوا كميا. لحظه المنشوف او هن رح ينهوا التشديد الكمي، هذا رح يبلش ينعكس الترند لفوق، ورح يكون هذا نوع من انواع التيسير الكمي، لانه هن حيبلشوا شو يشتروا، رح يبلشوا يشتروا سندات خزينه من الاسواق، وبالتالي يعطوهم سيوله للبنوك، وبالتالي البنوك رح تقدر يصير عندها سيولة تعطي قروض أكثر، ورح ينزلوا الفائدة، رح يصير فينا عالم أكثر تاخذ قروض، وبالتالي هي السيولة بتحسن كل الاقتصاد وبترفع كل الاسيتس، تمام، الانفستمنت اسيتس، سواء ستوك ماركت، سواء الاسهم الصغيره، سواء الكريبتو. فهيدي المرحله المفروض تجي يعني حسب الفدرالي انه من بعد نص سنه، تمام، لازم تبلش بهيدي المرحله. فنحن ناطرين هذا الشيء. المهم انه يصمد السوق بهالفتره 3 شهور، ما يصير في عندنا ازمات كبيره. فهذا الشيء تمام. لحديت هلا هيك البيانات لنا معطيات. هل عم يحاول تأجيل التضخم إلى الأمد البعيد، وماذا عن الحرب التجارية الحاصلة مع كندا وتأثيرها على السوق؟ تمام، حكيتهم شباب هدول الأفكار كلها. بالعكس، هو ما عم يحاول يأجل التضخم، هو عم يحاول يأجل سياسته النقدية التيسيرية ليتأكد أن التضخم عم ينزل بشكل صحي للمستوى 2%. تمام. رجعوا احضروا الشباب اللي عم يدخلوا جداد، رجعوا احضروا يعني على القليلة من بعد نهاية المؤتمر أنا رجعت شرحت كل شيء بالتفصيل. تمام. أخيرا شباب، إذا حدا مهتم بدورات سواء تعلم تداول أو دورة توقع ركود أو الدورات الزمنية بالسوق الكريبتو، هلأ في عرض خصم 90% على كل الدورات بموقع البيتكوين بالعربي. تمام، هتلاقوا الرابط تحت هذا الفيديو. اللي مهتم يتعلم، هاي فرصة ممتازة بمناسبة شهر رمضان الكريم والعيد. فبتمنى لكم كل التوفيق. شكرا للي بقوا معنا لهلا. نراكم إن شاء الله باللايفات القادمة. إذا فيكم تشجعوا اللي حواليكم نعمل سبسكرايب لنوصل لل100,000. ما بيانا كتير، لأنه في مفاجأة كتير حلوة رح أعلن عنها أول ما نوصل لل100,000. خلوكم متابعينا. كل التوفيق أحبابي، تصبحوا على خير.